This course is really focused on developing your technical skill sets for Illustrator and Photoshop. How to use the programs, what the tools do, and how to develop a workflow that's going to help you be a better motion designer in the future. We don't touch too much on design in this class, but in this bonus lesson, I really want to give you kind of a basics of design principles, things that you can start using right now that will improve the way that your designs are being built in this course and beyond. We do have more courses here at School of Motion that are specifically aimed at teaching you design principles, and you can go on to those after this course. But for now, I really want to just give you kind of a quick crash course into a few design principles that are just really beneficial and can help improve your designs right away. So here in Illustrator, I have a whole bunch of examples that we're going to work through. The first design principle that I want to talk about is contrast. Contrast can literally be any difference between objects. It could be 2 objects, it could be 10 objects. Whatever it is, as long as there's a difference, it's technically contrast. These 2 squares right here are identical. There is no contrast between them at all. They're both pure black, they're both exactly the same size. But if I were to say make this one bigger, and I were to make this one smaller, then I've created contrast in the scale. And suddenly, just between these 2 squares, this one feels bigger, maybe older or stronger, and this one feels smaller, much smaller, less powerful maybe. And these are just squares. Now this is the most basic stripped down version of contrast in scale, but you could swap these squares out with characters or text or photos, whatever they are, and just changing the scale like this will create a contrast that will get the viewer to view them in a very specific way. So like I said already, this is making the bigger square feel a little bit more powerful, maybe even older. And if I move this one down into the side a little bit, maybe this one now feels like it's closer to me and the one down here is further away. But you can actually create contrast in many more ways than just scale. So over here on my second artboard, I have 2 squares again. And this time, instead of scale, I'm going to create contrast in shape. So there we go. We have a square and a circle. Again, extremely stripped down, super basic, but these 2 objects are clearly different simply because they're a different shape. They're the same size, but because they're 2 different shapes, one has 4 corners, one is completely round, they have different personalities, and you can use that to your advantage in your design, using that contrast to give personality to your objects. And again, it doesn't just have to be these simple geometric shapes. You could swap out the square with a car and the circle with a hot air balloon, and putting those 2 next to each other is going to create a contrast because one is a land vehicle and one is something that flies in the air. And those 2 objects are very different shapes. So just by placing those 2 objects next to each other, you're creating a contrast that your viewer might only subconsciously register, but it is something, it's a tool that we can use as designers to help shape the way that somebody is thinking about whatever they're seeing. We can do more things with contrast. We've already seen scale and shape, but you can also have a scale in proximity or distance from each other. So these 2 triangles are perfectly spaced out from each other. There's this gap and they're totally identical. But if I bring this one over here, now we've got 2 triangles on top of each other. So they feel like they're together. Maybe they have a relationship with each other. If I made this one a little bit smaller, what if that was maybe like a parent and a child, or a mountain peak and a smaller mountain peak? I could also do the opposite. Instead of bringing them together, I could push this one way off to the side and combine a couple of these techniques and add contrast in not only proximity, but scale as well. And now if I just continue this a little bit and push it a little bit further, again, we've got this whole distance contrast happening where this one might look like it's closer to the camera and this one's further away from the camera. They're the exact same shape, but the way that I've positioned and scaled them has created something that you perceive as a viewer to be distance. All right, so we've looked at proximity, we've looked at shape, we've looked at scale. Down here, though, we have some text, and we can actually create contrast with text using weights of fonts. So if I were to take this second word right here and change it from the thin version to the bold version, now I have contrast in weight between these 2 objects. They happen to be blocks of text, but the same principles apply. And if I were to say move this one down here, move this one up, I'll just center it up here. I can make this one much smaller, I can make this one much bigger, and there we go. We've again combined a couple of these techniques, scale and weight, to show how these two different words have two different roles in my design. I could also reverse this, make this one really big, even though it's a super thin font, and then I'd make this one much smaller. It doesn't matter what these words are saying right now, but the fact is I can use this scale contrast to create a design that's interesting and feels different than the one that I had just a second ago. We can also have contrast in color. So here are a bunch of circles that are all kind of a blue-gray color. But if I were to take maybe this one and I changed the color to, say, kind of a pink color, that one really stands out, doesn't it? Even though it's exactly the same size as all of the other dots on this frame, because it's a different color, it's contrasting with everything else, it stands out, and your eye goes straight to it. That's one of the reasons to use contrast, is to direct the viewer's eye to something very specific. And you can do lots of contrast with color. It doesn't have to just be in the hue. That's basically what I changed here. You can also apply contrast in saturation. So if I made everything this color, and then I picked a different one, and then I brought up my color, I could grab, say, the saturation. Let's switch to hue, saturation, brightness. And I'm going to make that one much paler. Again, that one is going to stand out from everything else. The hue is exactly the same. The brightness is even exactly the same, but the saturation is different. If I undo that and pick this one, I could change the brightness and maybe make that one darker or make it a little bit lighter. Actually, that's pretty much 100% brightness, so I can't get any further than that. But if I were to select everything but that and make it darker, there we go. Now it's singling it out again. So between hue, saturation, and brightness, you can really create a lot of contrast just by using color, and you can mix and match those as well. You could adjust the hue and the saturation. There are lots of possibilities with color when it comes to contrast. You can also apply contrast in texture. So here we have a very smooth looking gradient, and over here we have a very noisy textured gradient that has all these rough edges around the outside. These two objects feel very different just because of the textures that I used on them. Contrast is huge in the world of design, and it's one of the easiest design principles to apply. As you can see, just from these 6 examples, there are so many different ways that you can apply contrast to change the way that your design is being perceived. Whether it's with very simple shapes or type or photos and videos, it doesn't really matter. As long as you're building in contrast and thinking intentionally about how that contrast is affecting the design, then you're implementing that design principle. And I'm going to jump over to Photoshop for a second to show you a great example of how scale contrast can have an effect on your design. This is a 3D render from an artist known as Beeple. His real name is Mike Winkelmann, but he's an amazing Cinema 4D artist who has been creating a unique piece of art every single day for over 10 years now. But I've actually modified this render to show you that there's no real sense of scale in this design. You kind of see like this opening, a door or a window. You're not really sure what that hole is right here. And outside of that hole or that opening is potentially a planet, maybe like Mars or something, but there's no sense of scale because I don't really have a frame of reference for what I'm looking at. But as soon as I take my modification off, you instantly know how large that opening is because you have a frame of reference, a point of context for how big that opening is because we have a human sitting there in the frame. That's something that you can relate to and understand the scale of this environment. That's something that's very important to think about. If you're trying to create something that looks very large, but you have no frame of reference for how large it actually is, then your viewer isn't going to know how large it's supposed to be. So adding in elements as a point of reference, something that gives context to the viewer, is really important to think about and really effective in helping you make your designs come across the way that you want them to when your viewer is looking at them. All right, I'm going to go back into Illustrator and take a look at some more examples. Okay, so what do we have here? It's just a circle on top of this rectangle. It kind of looks like a ball on top of the ground. Open sky above it, feels pretty open, no big deal. But if I bring this one up here and I move this line like this, suddenly it looks like we've got an incline, right, like a hill, that the ball is traveling down. And it is at such an angle that your brain is probably telling you that ball is probably traveling pretty quickly. So just by playing with the placement of those points and changing the angle of that ground plane, I've created a feeling inside of your head that's telling you how you should be perceiving this design. And if I were to do something like make this a little bit smaller, not quite as big of an incline, and then I flip it, I duplicate it and flip it so that it's at the top of my frame, and then I'll flip it again on this axis. I'll bring this one down a little bit, and then maybe squash this circle out just a tiny bit and rotate it so it matches that angle. Now it's starting to feel almost a little claustrophobic, especially if I put it down here and I bring this point down even further. Now it feels like it's getting compressed, like it's rolling down this tunnel and getting stuck between the ceiling and the ground, and it's feeling claustrophobic. Just by adding that extra shape on top and enclosing that space, creating that contrast with value, really, the value difference between white and black. And it's a completely different feeling than that one circle sitting on the flat plane. So think about how you can mess with your compositions, basically play around with the way that things are laid out to make the viewer feel claustrophobic or comfortable. That's something that you can do with very basic shapes, as long as you're thinking about the proximity of things, the contrast of things, and how it's all working together. All right, let's move on to the next example. These three circles are going to represent balance. That's the next design principle I want to talk about. Balance is literally a feeling, something that you should be thinking about all the time as a designer, is how it is making you feel. These three circles are all different sizes, but they're in a nice uniform line, so they feel balanced horizontally, but this side of the frame is pretty empty down here. And if you think about these three objects having a mass, it kind of looks like this one's sitting on the ground and these two are floating. So if I were to grab all three of these, make this the key object, and then align it to the bottom, now it feels like they're all balanced by all sitting on that one ground plane. It feels more natural because it's kind of obeying the laws of physics almost. But I could balance this in another way. If I were to undo and then scale all this down just a little bit and rotate it, now they're completely symmetrically aligned in this vertical layout. And maybe they're not necessarily sitting on the ground. Maybe these are planets that are aligned in space, so gravity doesn't really apply. Either way, this is a very symmetrical design because it is aligned perfectly to the center of my document, and each circle is perfectly aligned and evenly distributed. So that's an example of a symmetrically balanced design. But you can also have asymmetrical balance. If I were to say move this one over here and make it a little bit bigger, and then move this one up here, make it a little bigger, and then move this one here, this does not feel balanced. Again, I have that same feeling of all this empty space compared to not much empty space over on this side. This circle is almost taking up the entire left half of the frame, and then I have all this emptiness over here that these circles are kind of just hovering above. It feels like something is going to fall almost. So if I were to just say move this one down here to fill in that void a little bit and play around with the placement of these, then I can create what's called an asymmetrical balance. These three circles feel like they go together a little bit better now, even though they're not symmetrically aligned at all. It's an asymmetrical balance, but it is balanced. And this applies to everything. You should always have a balance of your objects in your layouts, whether it's text, photos, shapes, it can be anything. But if you have awkward gaps of space that aren't filled with anything, and other sections of your composition that are just blocked off to the edges almost, it's going to feel unbalanced, and you're going to need to work on that. It's going to be jarring to you and to your viewers. All right, let's take a look at one last example, talking about hierarchy. Now, we already talked a little bit about this in the typography lesson, but I want to just give you another example of it. Hierarchy, whether it's using typography or objects, is designed to let the viewer know what they should look at first, just like the text says. So how could we build a hierarchy into this text? Well, first of all, I'm going to break up the text into a few different lines. So I'm going to take the first word and make that its own line. Then I'm going to duplicate that and take lets the viewer know and put that on the second line. And then on the third line, I will put what they should look at first. All right, so I've got three different lines. I've got a little bit of a hierarchy going already. Maybe I make it a little bigger, but I can do a little bit better. Right now, everything is exactly the same. It's just on three lines. If If I take this top line, I could say make it all caps, and that's going to make it bigger and bolder. I could also change the boldness from demi to say black, and then make it bigger. So hierarchy is now the first thing that you see. It's big, bold, black. That's the first thing you're going to look at. Next up, I could take the lets the viewer know and maybe make it the same width as hierarchy. Something like that. And then I'll take this third line and scale it down and maybe even make it a little bit thinner. So medium or even regular. And then I'll just space these out evenly, roughly. I'm just doing this by eye right now. And then I'll align this to the center of my document. And there we go. Now I've got a hierarchy that lets the viewer know what they should look at first. The word hierarchy. It's a structure that you can build into your design so that you can clearly communicate what needs to be seen first. So if you can think about those things when you're designing, hierarchy, symmetry, balance, contrast, you're going to immediately see a difference in the way that your designs look. You're going to start to see things that look more cohesive and more professional, things that are actually being effective in communicating something that you're trying to communicate. I really hope that you start using these principles as you move forward and that you get excited about learning more about them in future courses. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.